welcome to those who are just joining. My name is Jessie Roth. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the Institute for the Development of Human Arts, or IDHA, the organization that's hosting this event. I'm a white woman with dark brown hair wearing a black turtleneck sweater, some black headphones. I have glasses on and a bun. And yeah, just really excited to have you joining us tonight for political uses of mental health laws in the US and Canada today. We will be grounding in history to develop shared strategies for the future. So I'll just be providing a little bit of grounding and introduction to the event before we pass it to the presenters. So first, wanting to provide a technology overview. As you can see, we are recording the first part of this event. The recording is going right now. We will be pausing the recording when we open it up for group discussion at the end, in case that's helpful for you to know in terms of participation. And this recording will only be shared with those who are registered for this event. We definitely encourage you to use the chat to engage with one another. Really important that the community agreements do apply to the chat. We'll be sharing those in just a moment. We might not be able to engage with all messages in the chat, but we always save the chat to engage with after the event with things that we might not get to. We have a team handling tech support, so you can reach out to Noah, IDHA Tech, in the chat if you have questions or challenges with tech. We also invite you to email contact@idha-nyc.org with any other questions that come up during or after the event. On accessibility, we have a team of 2 ASL interpreters joining us today. Thank you so much for being here, helping us make this event accessible. They will be swapping in and out at about 15-minute intervals, and they'll always be spotlit to aid access. If you would like to toggle between speaker and gallery view to see kind of more participants, there's a screenshot on the screen that shows how you can do that at the top right of your Zoom. We also have automated closed captioning available, and you can click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen to turn this feature on. If it's your first time joining an event by the Institute for the Development of Human Arts, or IDHA, I just want to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. We're a community bringing together current and prior service users, survivors, different mental health providers, such as psychiatrists, psychologists, and other clinicians, as well as activists and artists. And we all come together with a shared goal of transforming mental health care. And what we're doing at IDHA is advancing critical, effective, and scalable alternative approaches to mental health through collaborative education and community development. Part of what makes us unique at IDHA is the way that we are really aiming to integrate experiential and academic knowledge in order to challenge the idea that only those who work in the field of mental health are the experts. And we find that doing so really shifts power dynamics in a system that tends to privilege professional experience alone. So our community agreements for tonight are, first, shared expertise and wisdom. Everyone brings their own expertise to the conversation. We can all gain from and respect each other's various expertise. Second, collective liberation. Overcoming oppression aids everyone's liberation. It is our responsibility to challenge various forms of prejudice. We educate in the spirit of solidarity and hold each other accountable without criticizing who we are as people. And lastly, listen like allies. We respect a wide diversity of choices and perspectives, even when we disagree, and we don't judge or invalidate other people's experiences. So it is a great honor to be able to introduce our 2 presenters for this event. The first is Kelechi Ubozoh. Kelechi is a Nigerian-American writer and mental health consultant with over a decade of experience working in the California mental health system in the areas of research, advocacy, community engagement, suicide prevention, and peer support. Her story of surviving a suicide attempt is featured in the S-Word documentary, Oh, the Oprah magazine, and CBS This Morning with Gayle King. She has spent the last 3 years facilitating healing-centered spaces for BIPOC employees. Her book with LD Green, We've Been Too Patient, Voices from Radical Mental Health, elevates marginalized voices of lived experience who have endured psychiatric mistreatment, is featured in the curriculum at Boston University. More at KelechiUbozoh.com. We'll put some of these links in the chat as well. Welcome, Kelechi. And next, welcoming Rob Wipond. Rob is an investigative journalist who writes frequently at the interfaces between psychiatry, civil rights, community issues, policing, surveillance, and privacy, and social change. He is the author of the book, Your Consent is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships, which was published in 2023. So with that, I will take down my screen share. Really grateful again to have you all here. Thank you again for joining, and welcoming Rob, who's going to be sharing first. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jessie. Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Wipond, yes, and I'm a white man with short brown hair and wearing a nice bright red shirt today. So yeah, I'm going to do a presentation about the political uses of mental health laws at about 20 minutes long, and then with some of these themes and issues in our minds, we can then listen to Kelechi. She's going to talk about her personal experiences with involuntary psychiatric interventions. And then I'm going to talk with her a bit about that, from that, bringing some of these sort of political lenses. And then we're going to talk about some of the current developments going on in California with respect to sort of what we might call political interventions using mental health laws. And then we'll open it up, hopefully with lots of time left for all of you to participate in some way. I know that I think we're both really interested, all of us actually at IDHA too, I think, and me and Kelechi, we're really interested to hear some of your thoughts on these same issues too. So we're looking forward to some of that group discussion at the end. So with that said, I am going to share my screen and start a little PowerPoint show I have. All right, so that's just my book there, and all the sources today are from available on my website. And there's a picture of Kelechi's book, wonderful book. All right, so here's some reasons I just want to start with why we should be concerned about mental health laws potentially getting used for political purposes. Forced psychiatric interventions generally are potentially powerful tools for political punishment or control. They can be intimidating, threatening, physically aggressive, involving security guards, restraints, incarceration, and they can involve strong tranquilizing drugs. They can also lead to long-term fear and silencing after these experiences, and undermined credibility with the labeling that can take place. And they can actually practically lead to people losing assets and agency in their lives. So it's a very powerful potential tool for political oppression of some kind. Mental health laws have also been broadened over the last few decades to apply to many more people much more easily. And this is sort of what my book explores in depth. And the rates of psychiatric detentions across North America have been increasing since at least the 1990s in both countries. And for example, the best data we have in the US, we found that in about half this was a study out of UCLA, found that the rates were rising at about 3 times population growth, and that these rates already are double, triple, or more the typical rates in the UK and much of Europe. And at the same time, we have more psychiatric beds than we've ever had per capita. And the narrative in the media around this is quite misleading, because they usually only focus on state hospitals. But once you add in psychiatric beds in private and general hospitals and nursing homes and group homes, the numbers are really quite astounding. We have more today than we ever have had. So this really sets us up for a situation where we need to be very concerned about any potential politically abusive uses of this, aside from obviously that involuntary treatment can often be a very traumatizing experience for people. So what are political uses of mental health laws? The typical portrayal, of course, is that these are helping or healing intent, and that the goals are not political or social control. But I would ask here, is the intent even the important question to be asking? Or is it political if it has obvious political elements and impacts, regardless of the conscious intent behind it? And one of the reasons I particularly want to focus on conscious intent is because I don't think psychiatrists tend to think of themselves as ever doing it as political. So we can't really use that as the judge. And here's a great example of that. So I want to go back in history here first to one of the most famous cases of clearly political abuse of mental health law powers, and that was in the former Soviet Union. And this was internationally known because some studies had been done and had been exposed. There was media attention around the world at the time that they were locking up anti-communist protesters and political dissidents quite routinely, putting them in psychiatric hospitals, declaring them to be mentally ill, and forcibly treating them. And so there was all sorts of pressure on the Soviet Union around this internationally. And so the Soviet Union responded. And this was a response that came from the director of the Institute of Psychiatry in the Soviet Union at the time. And he was explaining that, okay, granted, these anti-communist protesters did have seeming clinical normality. These are all direct quotes from translation. However, he said, they had latent or slow developing schizophrenia. This is actually what they had, he said. And you could see this through the symptoms that they exhibited. And these symptoms were things like they complained about life under the Soviet regime, and this was moodiness. They avoided Soviet-sanctioned group activities. These were labeled as antisocial attitudes. And then they believed in radical social change. They believed it was needed and possible. And psychiatrists labeled this as exaggerated and delusional beliefs. And most potently, these beliefs that these dissidents had eroded their own financial safety and security within the Soviet Union. And so this was labeled as a diminished contact with reality. They were lacking insight. They were a danger to themselves. And interestingly, recently, Danius Puras, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Health for the UN, he's from Lithuania. And I heard him speak recently, and he highlighted that this indeed was what psychiatrists behind the Iron Curtain at that time believed. They believed these people were truly mentally ill. And so that kind of puts a framing around what we have. We can't really trust the psychiatrist to make the decision, and that also the flexibility of mental health labels in this kind of a context. And so now I want to leap forward in time. And this was someone else I recently saw give a talk, a person from Safeguard Defenders, and they put out this great report called Drugged and Detained, and it's about political detentions going on in China today. So I noticed some commonalities in these cases that they were highlighting, that none of the people engaged in violent behavior or were truly at risk of doing so. The police didn't do psychiatric evaluations, and the hospital evaluations were cursory, neither thorough nor transparent. And the detained people were often in conflicts with other people about unfairness, injustices, dominant social narratives, challenging social narratives. For example, they were resisting what they saw as tyranny, abuse, or misconduct. And one example was that a number of people got locked up over protesting housing evictions going on in the country. So what I want to highlight about this is the circumstances, both in the Soviet Union and China, they often involved conflicts with organizations, institutions, or agencies that were linked to the government or to public funding. But political detentions, when they defined them as that, did not necessarily mean, explicitly controlled by the central government in Moscow or Beijing. That wasn't it. It wasn't like some centralized, powerful force that was out there dictating who got locked up. It was much more decentralized. And a lot of these procedures that I just highlighted are very common today in North America. So that's what I wanted to highlight, is that psychiatric social control power is often not centralized, but is flexible and adaptable for use by many institutions and in diverse circumstances. So we can't really understand properly what a political use of mental health law is unless we understand this. It doesn't just emanate, I mean, it could theoretically emanate from a powerful political source just saying, lock that guy up. But what we're really seeing more often in countries is something more like this, a kind of dispersed power source. So now I want to talk a bit about some examples of clearly highly politicized uses of mental health law powers in North America today. I don't think anybody would dispute these, and these are all that I explore them in my book. So against whistleblowers, this is quite common. So this is Adrian Schoolcraft here, New York Police Department, police officer who was exposing corruption in the police department, and his fellow officers conspired to get him locked up in a psychiatric hospital. He's ultimately gotten a settlement from the city and from the hospital, enormous amounts of money. That's good for him, but that's because he had a ton of evidence to prove to expose what he was writing about. And you can imagine this happens to lots of people who can't rally that kind of evidence. He'd been documenting things and recording conversations for months. Tom Devine, the legal director of the Government Accountability Project that represents many whistleblowers, told me that forced psychiatric evaluations and detentions of whistleblowers are in fact still today a bread and butter harassment tactic in America. Another sort of style that I found that I had no knowledge of prior to doing the research for my book was targeting of pregnant women throughout in all the states, primarily where they already have some political resistance to abortion in particular, or other sorts of morality at work. And so it could be that they're trying to prevent some sort of abortion activity, or it's around drug use or attempted drug use or suspicion of drug use, where they're forcing people who are pregnant into drug treatment of some kind or some other sort of facility, in some cases actually ironically drugging them with even more dangerous psychotropic drugs in these kinds of circumstances. And this is now, it's quite a phenomenon. Like some states have actually written specialized laws just to do this. So they're going even further than the existing mental health laws. And Wisconsin is sort of a well-known one for that, having a very aggressive set of laws to control pregnant people. Another one we just saw going through was anti-mask and anti-vaccine protesters. They were getting labeled as delusional and dangerous to others. And just to show you the other side, now we're seeing people with long COVID also being, in some cases, forced into psychiatric evaluations or locked up, and they're being labeled as faking or delusional in some kind of cases. So again, I'm not saying that this is like systemic or widespread, but we are seeing cases of it. It's this sort of decentralized phenomenon in that way. This is another one I found. Again, I'm not trying to say this is some organized stuff. This is why I'm giving you it sort of across the political spectrum here. You can see it's from left, right, center, and everywhere in between. So now we can look at, there's been a lot of writing in psychiatry and psychology on the dangers of having catastrophic thinking about climate change, and they're labeling it as distress, catastrophic, irrational. And this is a fellow that I interviewed for my book who spent some time in a psychiatric facility, and he said, yeah, like my feelings about climate change were constantly reinterpreted as he's depressed and that's why he thinks the world is collapsing. It made me mistrust my own perception of reality. So it can be very, very challenging to be put in this kind of position. So that's just some of the highlights there, sort of, I think I would call those extreme cases, right? Very clearly political. And I wouldn't want to suggest that they're, as far as I know anyway, really widespread, although I have to say that it's very difficult to get data on any of this kind of stuff. So we really don't know. If I found out tomorrow that in fact we had some evidence that some of these are really widespread, I wouldn't be entirely surprised. But now I want to talk about examples of uses of mental health law powers by institutions and for institutional management. With this kind of context set up, I hope it'll be really clear why I'm calling these very politicized uses of these laws. So what we're seeing now, and this is getting into the mainstream media, which is great. There's more coverage of it because we're getting some data from different states, and that is schools using it against disruptive or distressed children. And this is like such a widespread phenomenon now. I think the numbers from Florida are telling us 1 in 100 children. So basically you take, 3 average classes, and at least one of those kids in any given year has been sent to a psychiatric hospital by force, for misbehaving in the classroom. So teachers are using this in a really common way as a way of managing classrooms. And also family and social services. There was a great report that came out of New York recently about this too, particularly racialized contexts where they're sort of using under the guise of child protection. They're utilizing mental health laws as one of a number of tools that they can kind of bring to bear to rip families apart, take kids into state control, or decide which member of a family in a custody battle will be allowed to have the child, and things like that. Nursing homes are another really big area where mental health laws are being increasingly used. So assisted living and long-term care facilities as well. They're using antipsychotic medications essentially for behavior control, for inducing docility of some kinds. And even you'll see here in this New York Times headlines, they're often fabricating diagnoses for that. And this is so well known that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid has twice now instituted formal programs trying to stop psychiatrists and medical doctors from just labeling everybody as schizophrenic so that they can justify using antipsychotics, because they've been trying to get this rampant use of these drugs out of long-term care. They know it's unnecessary. They know it's abusive in a lot of cases. And just to let people know, if you're in Canada, the rates are actually worse. We're around 20% in America, and in Canada, we're around up to 40% of people in long-term care have been put on antipsychotics. And then you add in other psychotropics and the numbers get even higher. And everybody knows this is just not in any way, scientifically justifiable. Or another group, which I didn't know a lot about when I started my research and was surprised by, is workplaces using these mental health laws more and more. So there's an NBC News report you'll see where they found that it was systemic, that at Google, all these people were complaining about racism and sexism and harassment in the workplace, and they were being regularly advised to seek mental health care. And as you can probably imagine, what I found is that, advice to seek mental health care rapidly becomes pressure to seek mental health care, particularly in a workplace. If it's your boss, it becomes coercive, it becomes involuntary. And in fact, these mental health first aid programs are frequently coaching everybody in the workplace. This is part of their training and education, to call 911 if you're in any way concerned about your fellow colleague in the workplace. And so I found this was particularly acute ironically, among medical professions, but also further in many of the licensed professions, because licensing gave employers an additional tool of threat over the employees. And so wherever there was conflict in the workplace and management wanted to discipline someone or control them, whether it be for legitimate or illegitimate reasons, reasons that you or I might agree with or disagree with, this was a tool they used. And the physician health programs in particular have actually gotten a fair bit of coverage around this, because many quite high profile physicians have started speaking out and criticizing these physician health programs. And they actually are accusing them of not only being abusive, but of being corrupt to the point of that they're profiteering, because often these doctors are forced into, say, they're labeled with some bogus psychiatric condition or substance use condition, and then told to go to a 3-month-long residential retreat for treatment, and it'll cost them $80,000, things like that. So some people making enormous amounts of money, and some doctors are quite convinced that that's actually the main driver, or one of the main drivers, is that corruption. So I also found lots of examples of banks, airports, tax authorities, government agencies using mental health law powers against complainants and protesters, and as previously stated, against their own workers sometimes too. And this fellow here in the picture is Gordon Stewart. This is where I first learned about it in Canada. He was in where I was living at the time. He was in a conflict with Revenue Canada, which is the equivalent of the IRS in Canada, and was protesting outside their offices, and they kept calling 911. They knew he wasn't breaking the law, so they kept kind of 911, sort of characterizing him as a crazy man on the street. And the police came and repeatedly talked to him, said, "Oh, he seems like just a legitimate protester." But by the end of it, the police were just kind of sick of it too, and they didn't even interview him the third time, and they took him up to the psychiatric hospital, and he was locked up for 10 days, forcibly drugged. He still speaks out to this day about the abuses of these laws in this particular way. And I found other examples of this kind of thing, quite institutionalized. Here you'll also see I've highlighted that the IRS actually has a policy around it, and not only a policy of it, but they have two programs, and it was audited a few years back by the Inspector General. The program, how well is it working? How many people under potentially dangerous taxpayer or caution upon contact cases are we highlighting, and what are we doing with them? And it gets a bit amorphous, but part of their policy is definitely to call 911, particularly if a person is in a despairing mood. For example, they got a bad tax report and they're worried about it and they might feel suicidal, then they're told to contact 911. But clearly there's some implication that it happens in these other circumstances, like the one I just talked about here. Another big one, you might not think of it as political, but I'm going to talk in a second about how it is. So just profiteering, plain old profiteering, the Britney Spears case being a great example of that. But sometimes this is happening at a mass scale. So it's not just sort of individual rich people that are targeted, but poor people can be targeted, and poor people en masse, because you can still bill Medicare and Medicaid for a poor person, and a state can make a lot of money. They can get a lot of federal money. And so the states aren't really policing this at the level they should be. And so we get examples like this. So this is Universal Health Services, which is the biggest psychiatric hospital chain in America. They have about 200 psychiatric institutions that they control. And in 2020, and this is only some of the states, it's my understanding that still other states are under investigation by the Department of Justice. But about 5 states settled with the Department of Justice around this. So it was hospitals, for UHS hospitals, 5 states settled for $117 million, which, as you can imagine, is probably a lot of patients. That represents a lot of people they locked up. And there's a quote from the press release about it from the DOJ, that these were people who did not require hospitalization, and the UHS hospitals improperly used physical and chemical restraints and seclusion to keep these people and to keep them docile and unable to kind of resist their incarceration. So that is highly politicized as well. As you can imagine, this can be anybody in principle, and it often is. They capture quite a diverse section of the population, but it's being particularly used against poor people quite aggressively and in this manner. So we have very aggressive policing of homeless people going on. And this Disability Rights Oregon report, for example, found that there were more homeless people that were either arrested criminally or detained in psychiatric hospitals in a year than the homelessness count had actually found in the city. So these policing forces were finding more people than the surveys had found even existed. And this was usually not these people necessarily causing an interaction with police, but people calling 911 to report them. So, neighborhood associations and people on the street, with their varying motives, calling 911 on these people. And here's an example from a lawsuit in Canada, which was nice because it really delved into the issue. Here was a poor First Nations man who was detained. They gave him no psychiatric diagnosis. He had a bit of a brain injury, but he was pretty functional. He'd had a job for a long time prior to this, and they locked him up for 9 months. And their reasoning was there's no other place for him. Like they thought he's just going to degenerate if we let him go, so we're just going to keep him indefinitely. And they acknowledged they had many more people like this in the hospital. And so this is what the Department of Justice has actually been prosecuting over the last decade in numerous states, such that they've made settlements in the last decade in multiple states, covering tens of thousands of people for unnecessary institutionalization. And this was usually because there was just a lack of housing or a lack of supportive housing in this area where that institution was operating. And so they were just being kept indefinitely in these psychiatric hospitals, even though they no longer met the criteria for a psychiatric detention. And now I just want to add, throughout all the foregoing, there's also evidence from ample studies, done usually at a sort of regional level, because we don't have great national data, but of the influence of many of the dominant North American cultural political prejudices. So we'll see you're more likely to have this kind of thing happen to you, if you're poor, if you're racialized in some way, because of sexism and misogyny, homophobia, all the sort of dominant prejudices we're seeing out there in our society more generally. We see those manifesting in this kinds of activities. So that's another layer of politicization of these powers. And so the last one I want to highlight here is one that's kind of really, really flexible and really widely used, and has become so pervasive we're kind of almost just accepting it, but it's actually in some ways the most restrictive, and that is it's the expression, the control of lawful speech is really quite profound. This guy that I'm highlighting here, John, he had posted on his Twitter feed about withdrawing from psychiatric drugs successfully, and he was celebrating it and suggesting other people could do it as well. Well, it was only like a matter of days until someone called 911 on him and the police showed up at his workplace. Luckily for him, he knew the police officer personally. They played together in high school, something. So they just, talked about it and nothing bad happened to him. But it highlights, he said to me, it really scared me, like I realized how threatening this really was, that I could lose my right to this free speech in such a easy way. And this is actually institutionalized in the form of mandatory reporting around expressions of suicidal feelings. So you see people who are not allowed to talk about those kinds of feelings anymore. They'll get reported and get locked up as a danger to self or others. And of course, there's a lot of gray area there. It doesn't always happen. I'm just saying it's this flexible law that allows for control of that kind of speech. And the other one is refusing psychiatric medications. In actual court hearings, this is routinely used to define you as lacking insight. If you deny the diagnosis, if you say you don't want the medications, you're lacking insight, and it can be used against you to justify the involuntary treatment. So in that sense, I want to ask then, are not all psychiatric patients actually prisoners of conscience? This is how Amnesty defines a prisoner of conscience: a person who's not used or advocated violence or hatred, and they're imprisoned solely because of who they are or what they believe. And I would ask you, how many psychiatric patients really would meet those criteria, that they aren't advocating violence, but they're being detained against their will because of something they said, because of what they believe, because someone's decided that's too wacky, that's too crazy, that's too off, or the things they're saying are, and therefore somebody concludes that puts them at risk. So in that sense, I'd say maybe a large portion of psychiatric involuntary patients today are actually prisoners of conscience. And so I'll conclude with this. The theme that I want to ask you all about when we get to our discussion is, should we more often publicly describe involuntary psychiatric interventions as tools of social and political control? Or, is that not something that the general public is ready to grapple with or to believe? They'll think that sounds strange or paranoid. So I'd be interested to hear your thinking and your thoughts on that. So thank you very much. I am going to stop sharing now and turn it over to Kelechi. And thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Rob. That was amazing and also terrifying. So just want to acknowledge a lot of emotions came up. They always do when I hear my experiences and experiences of other people being validated. So just want to acknowledge that. I'm going to share with you a little bit from our book, Wipond to Patient Voices from Radical Mental Health. I'm going to share a little bit of my story, what it was like to be psychiatrically incarcerated as a teenager, and then what it was like when I was in my 20s. I'll tell you a little bit about that. I just always acknowledge that this may activate folks. And I think it's important to talk about what happens when you're put away or sent away. And a lot of folks in this room already have that experience or understanding. But I think it's really important for our advocacy to really just name, this is what it looks like, this is what happens. And I will just start reading. So this is called She Wasn't Crazy. She wasn't crazy, but the world had a way of making her feel so. You try being a Black goth girl in Stone Mountain, Georgia. She liked vampires and Morrissey and how the darkness wrapped around her like a warm, familiar blanket. She was always too sensitive and too reactive, felt every feeling at high voltage. She wasn't crazy, but she said whatever the fuck she wanted, spilled words from her lips like red wine on white carpets. She left many stains. They called her Crazy K and it stuck. She never slept. She crawled up fire escapes to hang off the edge, longingly looking down. She flirted with death. She wanted to know if she let go, would she be free? She wasn't crazy, but when Grandma, the ultimate matriarch, kissed her thick eye-lined face and marveled at her choice of combat boots with fishnets, while when Grandma died, the darkness welled up and started choking her. She wanted to stop the world and get off, because when your world ends, but you're still alive, there is something crazy about that. She was 13 when she wrote the first suicide note. It was on a Post-it. She wasn't crazy, but succinct. Not crazy, just honest. She didn't want to live. She got messy, and a friend found the note and called her mom. And all her mom could say is, why, baby? The words left her. Was she crazy? But she didn't feel crazy. They stripped her down like an animal, took her shoelaces, put her on suicide watch while she squirmed on an uncomfortable cot. She felt pretty crazy then. The psych ward for kids smelled like every hospital, bleached with a stench of death and disappointment. Even in this place, there was a psych ward hierarchy. They separated the kids with eating disorders from the crazy kids. The frail-looking teens never made eye contact. But the other kids got it. They all dreamed of McDonald's French fries and getting out of this sterile purgatory, this life-size pause button. One day, little Christine tried to open the locked door, but it wouldn't budge. The security guard said, "We lock it to keep the crazy people out." And she laughed uncontrollably. But in hindsight, she could see that he was right. Because when she left the psych ward, she created a paper mache mask of glitter and light. She smiled until her eyes bugged out. She stopped wearing liquid eyeliner and made everyone feel comfortable. She said all the right things and lied about the darkness. See, all better now. The moment she stopped telling the truth, well, that was the moment she was truly crazy. Okay, I hope you know that I really don't like the word crazy. I always have to say this right after that. That was my experience as a teenager. And I just want you to know, we're going to fast forward into my 20s, where I have been pretending to be okay over and over, wearing a mask, knowing that if I say the truth, I might get harmed. I might get put in a hospital again if I tell what's going on. So I just want you to imagine that your entire life trajectory is being judged based on a very low point in your life. And it could be a day, it could be a week, it could be months or longer. But for me, when it was in my 20s, it was the day I tried to kill myself following a sexual assault. When I was involuntarily committed, I was treated like a burden. I was told by the nurse not to let myself get raped again. As a Black woman, I have always had to consider the role that historical racism plays in my treatment and my care. At the at the hospital, I experienced chemical restraints where they gave me so many drugs. I couldn't function, I couldn't talk, I couldn't think. And I just got more verbal abuse. And what was the treatment modality? It was coloring and watching Silence of the Lambs. There was no therapy, there was no dignity, there was no peer support. We were told when to wake up, what to eat, what medication to take. There were no choices. I had been told I was mentally ill, I would never work, I'd never be in a relationship, I'd never have a fulfilling life. And I know this is not what my family wanted for me when they were trying to get me help. And the thing about my story is it's not rare, it's not even special, it's not unique. A lot of people don't understand what it's like to have someone make all of your decisions for you, take away your agency, and look at you like you're a broken child. That is what it's like to be sent away. The away place that we get sent, the institutions, the psychiatric incarceration, the space to heal wasn't healing. It was overcrowded and chaotic. And then I was released. No supportive linkages to community-based programs, no aftercare, nothing. So if the current treatment is traumatic, why are we expanding that? And I will just say that trauma from experiencing involuntary treatment like mine, it took me a long time to recover from. So I just want to name that because sometimes people want to send us away because they think we're going to be doing better away. And they don't know what happens behind closed doors and what away looks like. And people deserve and need voluntary options. So I'm going to have Rob join me. I appreciate you listening to my story. We're going to have a conversation and talk a little bit more. I'm going to take a deep breath because it's always a lot sometimes to share. Sometimes it's not too much, but it is sometimes. So
Thank you, Kelechi. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's so important, like without people like you being willing and able, right? And I know how hard it is, and I don't want to say anything about other people out there who aren't ready to speak publicly, but it's so important when people can do it I think for people to hear these stories, to understand what it's like, so thank you. And it certainly makes my work possible, but more importantly, right, I think it's such an important part of the political moment we're in that more people need to hear these stories. So thank you. Yeah, I was struck by, almost every line, I'm hearing, I think the thing, your story is in isolation, right? Because it's your story, your experience, but you're highlighting already, and that's what I kept hearing too, is wow, this is, it's resonating more broadly with what's happening in society right now and throughout your life. I mean, so I'm wondering, yeah, how would you understand if I'm asking you, retell that story in a sense of in political terms, like what are the things that you would say you saw social or cultural or political elements of in your experience?
yeah, I think what really aligned with me from what you were presenting earlier is that I was struggling with an experience, and to even name that experience because of sanism, it was, you can't even talk about it. So I can't, in order for me to get help, and I'm someone who deals with suicidality, in order for me to get help, I have to be so careful. I can't say certain words because I'll be locked up. I know I'll be locked up. I've been locked up. And so how do I say what I need to get without triggering the system to say I'm a danger to myself, when actuality, I just needed space to be listened to and share, like, wow, I'm thinking about death again. Can I have space to talk about it? The minute you say suicide, the conversation is over. So when you were presenting about a lot of people, and just, I mean, you've got protesters, you've got people who aren't even suicidal. They're fighting for their rights. this is just such a way of controlling people. We see that with, if I call a hotline, what kind of conversations can I have? So I don't have law enforcement deployed to me, because we actually have a high rate of people being killed, especially people of color, during a mental health chat, because because of structural racism, because of so many things. So I think it is political to even say what your mental health experience is and what you might be struggling with, because the system or people don't know how to react to it. And when they do, it is to shut you down, lock it up, and put it away.
Right. And I'm hearing too, like it has a strong it forces you to conform. It sounds like you're saying, right? You have to speak certain ways. You have to learn what's going to get me in trouble and what's not, and kind of be thinking about that all the time, instead of actually just dealing straight up with what you're going through, and you have to be mindful, and it's a conforming power. Right. And I'm highlighting that too, because you talked about in your childhood how you were always outspoken, and that's one of the things that kind of got you into trouble.
Yeah, I told the truth. I said I don't want to be here. And it was met with anger and judgment and fear, a lot of fear. And when people are afraid, they make some really interesting choices. But I also want to name, as a Black woman, I present well. So when I am in pain, people don't believe me, because I might not emote in the way, or I'm perceived as aggressive. So half of the time I'm trying to get support and someone doesn't believe me, but if I say the wrong word, they over believe me and they commit me. So it's like, it's a strange continuum to be on.
Yeah. And would you, how else did sort of race, uh was that a factor, I guess, in all of these experiences? Like, for example, I mean, were there lots of practitioners who were also Black that you could, relate to, connect to in some way, that could understand some of this? Or like, how is that, like, is the system itself kind of, more white than Black, I guess, even in your experience? Or how would you frame that?
Yeah, I mean, I would frame it as that and I'm not a huge person, I'll just name it. We have a whole book on like stories and research against the biomedical model, which is like, I'm looking at you, I'm going to check a box, I'm going to say you're ill. I'm not going to take in context of your culture or identity or race. So that's that one thing. But I will say, I got so many different diagnoses. It was almost like a buffet, because every person who witnessed me or saw me, and mostly white men for psychiatry, um, would come up with a different thing. And what would happen was, based on how I'm perceived, how I present as a Black woman, what I was told to use for treatment would make me worse, because it wasn't actually aligned with what I needed, but it was, oh, you look like this, or, a lot of people like you deal with, insert diagnoses. And later come to find out all of that is inaccurate, and made me actually feel worse and put me in really bad places. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's one way that it showed up for me.
Yeah, I mean, and it also seemed that you were highlighting themes around being a woman in our society too. And
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I think for me, I am way more comfortable talking about the experience of suicidality, than the actual experience of the sexual assault, because, and there was a whole Me Too movement, and I was silent during the entire thing, because as a Black woman, I've been over sexualized or mammied or all of these things, and people either blame the survivors about their experience. And so it was almost like, well, suicide is so uncomfortable for people to talk about, that I can live in this world, but the other part of my story I don't really talk about as much, because of how I'm treated. This nurse looked at me and said, "Oh, you're strong. You should have been able to fight someone off." She looked at a Black woman in a muscular body and told me I should have been able to fight someone off. Right? I'm like, would you ever, in a situation, we're in a psych ward. We're literally in a psych ward. And that is what you're telling someone who just experienced a rape, right? Like you can't even make this up. But I'm like, yeah, I know this is because I'm Black. And I'm not even gonna race light myself, which you don't know what race lighting is. It's gaslighting, but for racism. I'm not gonna say, oh, is that what she meant? Or no, I know what happened. So yeah, I think that's the other way that it shows up. You're strong. You should be able to handle this, et cetera, et cetera. And
Right.
so yeah, it's
Wow.
wild out there.
You're just striking me that there's another layer of sort of politics to this political, the connecting to the truth lie theme you raised, right? And also this, like the way that pain, really human pain, understandable human pain, is being reframed by this system all the time, right? And that's almost its primary function, so that you're in a situation where you're having this really understandable pain and all the reactions that, you know, are coming from that, and somebody's kind of like, quote unquote, coaching you, corralling you, trying to, you know, manipulate you essentially into reacting in a different way. So when we look at that, not just in your isolated case then, but multiplied through all the other people it's happening to, it's like we're seeing a system that is about reframing pain.
That is a really powerful way of putting it. And that part of control, I was enraged when this woman told me this. But I was like, I cannot react. This person has power of me. I would like to leave this place. So I'm going to smile. I'm going to be kind to everyone. I'm going to do everything I can to get out of the door. I'm going to pretend. I'm going to put on my resting nice face so I can leave this place. I am not allowed to express how I really feel, because she can add more days and call me hostile. Because I saw that happen to people who wanted to leave because there was no reason they should have been there. So I was like, oh, I'm seeing people get days added. I don't want that to happen to me. I have to be strategic, even in I'm in my worst place ever, and I have to be strategic, right? Like the level of work I'm doing in a psychiatric unit is way too much. This is some unpaid labor. My goodness, this is ridiculous.
I often say that, but the irony is that when you're in a psychiatric hospital, often you have to help them feel better. It's not
Yeah.
really about truly about you feeling better. If those coincide, that's great for you, right? But if they don't coincide, the main thing is they have to feel better about letting you go, or you're never getting out, right?
Never. Exactly.
What's striking me, right, is this whole theme now we hit, Priya, of reframing pain, right, and looking at this multiplied out. And I can't help but think, like, we know this is something that affects so many people, right? And I want to talk a little bit about, I know you're in California, you're doing advocacy work in that space, and I'm wondering, how you might, add to that now, like what you're seeing and how your own experiences of the system are, driving some of your concerns about the developments you're seeing now in California.
Yeah, and if thank you for that question. And there are so many advocates who are doing really important work around a lot of the bills that are happening in California and can speak way more eloquently than I can about it. But for those of you who don't know, there's been just a rash of different laws that have been expanding forced treatment. And I mean, we have so many different things. We have care court, which is essentially like an involuntary referral. So a family member, a police officer, a court, a government official can say, hey, this person needs treatment, and force that person. And I think one of the challenges is that it's in the civil court. And so people are like, oh, it's a civil court. It's voluntary. And so there's been media coverage that says it's voluntary. But my question is, how can something be voluntary when there are consequences for not following up with your care plan, where someone decides where you live, what medical treatment you should have? And if you do anything that's non-compliant, you could be referred to a conservatorship. So to me, anytime someone says, oh, you're non-compliant, or like what you're talking about before, when someone said, oh, I don't want that medication. Oh my gosh, they're unwell, they're ill, they're non-compliant. Let's refer them into more forced treatment. So you've got Care Court, which I tried really hard to fight. Disability Rights of California did such amazing work there, and it still exists. So we got that one. We got SB 43, which expanded the definition of grave disability So it can subject more people into involuntary hospitalizations and conservatorship. So now if you have a substance use, you can also be conserved, right? They're like, let's expand. And then the third one, I mean, I can't even say third. There's more than this, but the one that I've been fighting all summer with many different mental health advocates is been, first it was called Prop 326. I can't even remember. Yes, SB 326. It was the Mental Health Service Act modernization, and then it combined AB 531. So it basically, and what they're trying to say is, hey, let's provide housing for the unhoused and take care of these mentally ill people, and we're going to really help them, and we're going to really take all of the prevention dollars and focus it on crisis, because we've got serious crisis, and our Governor Newsom is really about fixing the crisis. And what's really happening is that they're actually going to be having the original bonds had, you can't have involuntary, you have to have voluntary unlocked facilities, and then dead of the night, the like last day before it passed, they struck that. So now it's going to be hospital beds, not homes. And this is a way of trying to fix the homeless problem. We've spent $20 billion on the homeless problem, and we've done everything but actually have affordable housing, which our unhoused advocates have been telling us. Housing First research, data, all of the things have said. And so, and other people can say a lot of different things about it, but it's like we have this sweeping thing of bills that are just trying to say that they're fixing problems, but they're forcing people into, I don't know if I can call it treatment, but forced care, which I can't even call care. It's like force.
Yeah, and
it gets me really mad.
Yeah, and part of that referendum that's coming up, it's looking like their intent is to use billions of dollars to build sort of dormitory-like facilities of some kind. Unclear what that's going to be, but it sounds like they're going to be very coercive because it's going to be subject to these full-service partnership programs, which do tend to be quite coercive. So yeah, it's overwhelming, eh? Like there's so many different pieces of this legislation coming in right now that it's hard to keep track of it all. And how are you feeling about, I guess, moving forward, trying to protest this? Do you think that there's going to be some public educating that can succeed?
We've been trying to do a lot of public education, and I just want to be clear, forcing someone to do something against their will is forced treatment. Unfortunately, we have lots of liberal, I don't know if I can call them well-intentioned anymore because we've given them education, but folks who appear well-intentioned who are saying, oh, these people just can't, they just need our help. And if you ever think that taking someone's civil rights away is helpful, it is not. So I just need to name that. And we're still fighting. We have a campaign right now, No on Prop 1. Please tell people, please educate people, please have a conversation that the unhoused population is not the result of mental illness, and that we need affordable housing, and we should stop forcing people into these carceral situations. And I think if we have education and more conversations, we can impact the public. But I know we've got a tough hill. We got a tough hill to climb. And I'm just grateful that like people like you are doing this work, uncovering things that are really, really detrimental, and that people don't believe us, or they try to then put it as part of a mental illness, like you're paranoid. I'm like, there's literally data and history of this. So I just want to name that, and I'll still keep hope alive or fight even if I don't have as much hope, because I've been in those places and they're not a place of healing.
Yes, thank you, Kelechi. And we can throw into the chat maybe some of the groups that that are organizing right now. We still have like half an hour. I'm so excited because we can now open it up to get some people from the audience if they want to ask questions or contribute in some way on anything we've covered, either the political stuff or the Kelechi story and her experiences, or some of this California, whatever you want to wade in on. We'd love to hear from you.
If few quick IDA announcements before we close. If you enjoyed this conversation about political uses of mental health laws, IDA recently opened enrollment for a new training called the Transformative Mental Health Core Curriculum. We've been working on it for 3 years, more than that maybe. And it's a really amazing opportunity if you are looking to learn more about how did we get to where we are today with the current, medicalized, pathologizing mental health system and a lot of the history. There's a section that's called Madness and Oppression that really does focus on a lot of the themes that were discussed today. Really grateful to have incorporated some work by both Kelechi and Rob in this curriculum. So gratitude to you both. There are 50 faculty members, so you can learn from a wide breadth of people. I think the link is going to be in the chat, and just would encourage you to come learn with us more, learn and unlearn. I think that's a big part of this work. So there's a lot more information on the link, but wanted to share that as one piece. In terms of the follow-up, there is a link in the chat for a feedback form. Really would love if you all were able to take just a couple minutes to share any feedback on this event. I promise we read it all. We really appreciate hearing how this landed with you, what you want to see with IDA in the future, share it with our facilitator. So the link is there, but you'll also be receiving a follow-up email from us in the coming days with the recording, again, the presentation and this little end part here as well as the closed caption transcript, anonymized chat transcript, and the feedback form will also be in there as well in case you prefer to kind of reflect. And then another invitation to join our community and become an IDA member. If, again, you are feeling moved and resonated with this event, if you become an IDA member, it's just a way of kind of joining a growing community of change makers who are also trying to change the system, everything from, I heard, burn it down. What do we do when we're working in it? Like asking all of these questions all the time. People with lived experience, clinicians, family members, activists, artists, etc. So that link is in the chat. There's a short form looking at our principles and values and our community agreements, and there are tiered dues. If the dues don't work for you, email us. No one is ever turned away for lack of funds. So we hope you'll stay connected. And then last but not least, these are kind of all the links and the socials for IDA, our website, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Would love to stay in touch that way as well. So lots of options. Those are kind of my last couple of words. I'll stop sharing. And yeah, I think just the last note of deep gratitude to both of you for being here, for sharing your work, your stories, and to all of you, thank you for spending your Thursday afternoon, evening, whatever time. And I want to also give a shout out to our access team, our ASL interpreters, to Noah on tech. And yeah, I hope everyone has a really nice rest of your night and keep fighting. Yeah.